The room was built to make people feel small. That was the point of it. The ceiling went up 4 stories and was made of something black and polished, like the inside of a very expensive coffin. The walls curved inward at the top, so the whole chamber felt like a throat about to swallow you. The light came from nowhere and everywhere, cold and flat. The kind of light that made shadows disappear. No shadows meant nowhere to hide. That was also the point. Yara Osei had been in the room twice before. Both times as an observer. Both times she had watched other ambassadors stand at the center podium and shrink. Not visibly, not in a way you could point to, but by the end of each session, something in those ambassadors was smaller than it had been at the start. Today she stood at the podium herself. She had sent her staff home, all 11 of them. They had looked at her like she was making a mistake. She had said nothing, just pointed at the door, and they had gone. The conclave filed in. There were 9 of them today. 9 senior voices, representing the 11 species that ran the galaxy the way a landlord runs an apartment building. Technically, efficiently, and without much interest in what the tenants thought. They wore their formal robes, which were long and layered, and clearly designed to take up space. They settled into their curved bench above the podium, looking down at her the way judges look at someone they've already decided about. The senior voice in the center was the oldest. His name was something Yara's translator rendered as Son Veth, which meant something like, the one who has seen enough to stop being surprised. He was tall, even sitting down. His face had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 2 centuries being obeyed. He began to speak. The translator in Yara's ear turned his words into flat, clean English. Ambassador Osei, the conclave acknowledges your presence and extends the courtesy of this formal hearing. A pause. Not for effect, just because he breathed differently than humans did. We will now present the record of human violation that necessitated the corrective action taken against the settlement designated Kepler's Ridge. Corrective action. Yara kept her face still. The record was read by a junior voice, a younger one with pale gray skin and nervous hands that she kept folding and refolding on the bench. The record was thorough. It detailed the exact coordinates where 3 human survey ships had crossed the boundary. The boundary was not marked by any beacon. It was not filed in any public registry. But it was, the junior voice explained carefully, implied by the established territorial patterns of the conclave's border species, and any civilization of sufficient intelligence should have been capable of inferring its existence. The 3 ships had crossed it by 4 light minutes. 4 light minutes. Yara knew the number. She had been staring at it for 6 weeks, since the night the message came through, and she had sat in her kitchen on Orbital Station 7 and read the words on her screen, and then sat very still for a long time. 47,000 people. The junior voice continued reading. She described the response fleet that had been dispatched. She described the 11 minutes it had taken. She used phrases like proportional deterrence and necessary demonstration of jurisdictional integrity. She never said the word destroyed. She said corrective action 4 more times. Yara counted. When the record was finished, Son Veth looked down at her. His eyes were gold and very steady. He had eyes like a very old clock, like something that had been keeping time longer than anyone had been alive to check it. The conclave offers humanity the following resolution, he said. Full withdrawal from the disputed corridor. A period of monitored compliance lasting no less than 30 standard years, and a formal acknowledgement of violation to be filed in the conclave's permanent record. He folded his hands. These terms are generous. Previous cases of this nature have carried harsher conditions. The conclave recognizes humanity's relative youth as a spacefaring civilization, and has adjusted its expectations accordingly. Relative youth. like a parent telling a child they were being let off easy. Yara looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Then something moved across her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It wasn't the bright, panicked look of someone calculating what they could salvage. It was a smile. Not a big one. Not a warm one. The kind of smile that lives right at the edge of a laugh that isn't funny. The kind of smile a person gets when something they expected to hurt turns out to hurt in exactly the way they prepared for. And the preparation was worth it. And now they know something the other person doesn't know they know. Sonveth had seen a lot of faces in 2 centuries. He had never seen that face. Well done, Yara said. Her voice was quiet. The room's acoustics were built to swallow quiet voices. Hers didn't get swallowed. You just declared war on us. No one in the chamber moved. She picked up the single folder she had brought with her, tucked it under her arm, and walked out. They echoed off the black walls and came back to her, clean and even, all the way to the door. The door opened for her because it was automated and it didn't know better. She walked out into the corridor and kept walking. Behind her, in the chamber, 9 senior voices sat in complete silence. Sonveth stared at the door for a long time after it closed. He was not a man who got unsettled. He had sat in this room while species begged, while species wept, while species tried to bargain with things they didn't have. He had watched 43 civilizations look at the math of resistance and decide it wasn't worth it. He sat with the memory of that smile and tried to file it somewhere useful. He couldn't. The junior voice with the nervous hand spoke first, quietly. Should we send a follow-up communication to clarify the terms? No, Sonveth said. Should we escalate the fleet presence in the border corridor? He didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the door. He thought about the 43 species, the way they had all done the same thing, looked at the math, seen their own smallness reflected back at them by the size of the conclave's power. Folded. It wasn't weakness, it was intelligence. Any intelligent being, when faced with something it cannot win against, stops fighting. He thought about the smile. Yes, he said finally, escalate. He told himself it was routine. He had given the same order 43 times. He did not sleep well that night, which was unusual for him. He lay in his quarters on the conclave's central station and looked at the ceiling and tried to identify what was sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone. It took him until nearly morning to name it. It was the feeling of having already made a mistake. He didn't know what the mistake was yet. He would. Archivist Shen had cataloged 21 species. She was good at it. Methodical. Patient. She had a way of looking at a civilization's data the way a doctor looks at a scan. Detached. Careful. Looking for the thing that didn't fit. And she always found it. The thing that explained why a species behaved strangely under pressure. The cultural glitch. The grief response misfiring. The misread signal that looked like aggression but was actually fear wearing aggression's coat. She expected to find the same thing in humanity's file. Sonveth had called her personally, which was unusual. He had said, I need you to explain the smile. She had asked which smile. He had sent her the recording without another word. She watched it 11 times. Then she opened the archive. Humanity's file was technically complete. 70 years of formal observation. Trade records, population data, expansion maps, the survey of their technology, which was rated as developing, non-threatening, showing appropriate deference to established galactic structure. The behavior profile was flagged as socially complex but non-aggressive. There was a note at the bottom, written by the original cataloging archivist, that said, in the conclave's administrative language, something that translated roughly to loud, messy, but manageable. Shen started at the beginning. The first anomaly showed up in hour 4. It was small, a data point in their military history, specifically, the number of distinct conflicts recorded on their home planet in the last 3,000 years. The number was high. She flagged it as expected. Species with violent histories were not unusual. Most civilizations had them. The difference was in what came after the violence. Most species, once they developed the technology and the social structure to stop fighting large-scale wars, stopped. Humanity had not. The wars got more organized, more industrial, more efficient. She kept reading. Hour 7. She found the records from what humans called the Second World War, a single-planet conflict. No alien involvement, no outside pressure. Just one species on one world dividing itself into halves and destroying those halves against each other, with a level of industrial thoroughness that made her set down her notes and sit back in her chair. The numbers were hard to read even in the abstract. Tens of millions. Some estimates higher. In under a decade, on one planet, against themselves. She sat with that for a while. What she expected to find next was collapse. Social disintegration. The kind of civilizational trauma that takes centuries to heal and leaves a species permanently cautious. Permanently small. She found the opposite. 40 years after that war, humans were in space. She checked the date 3 times. It was correct. 40 years. The species that had done that to itself was, 4 decades later, pointing rockets at the stars. Not because they had healed. The records made clear they hadn't entirely healed. But they had taken the thing that should have broken them and used it as fuel. She kept reading. Hour 12. She started pulling the cultural records, the art, the literature, the music. The conclave's standard protocol was to skim these. They were useful for understanding surface behavior, but rarely changed the core assessment. Shen found herself reading them properly. The art made during the wars was the part that unsettled her the most. Not the art made after, about grief and memory and loss. That she understood. Every species made art like that. But the art made during, while the wars were happening. Songs written in trenches. Paintings made in bombed cities. Jokes, actual jokes, told by people who were hungry and cold and watching their world come apart. She kept coming back to the jokes. There was a word in one of humanity's older languages. She asked her translator for the closest conclave equivalent. It gave her back a phrase that meant roughly finding something worth laughing at in a situation where laughing is inappropriate and also the only sane response. She stared at the phrase for a long time. Then she pulled the linguistic data. She had been told in her training that a species' vocabulary told you more about its psychology than anything else. You could understand what a civilization feared by looking at how many words it had for fear. What it loved by its vocabulary for beauty. Humanity had 63 distinct words and phrases across its major languages, specifically for the feeling of surviving something that should have killed them. 63. The conclave's oldest species had 4. She went back to the smile. She watched the recording again. Yara Osei standing at the podium. Son Veth reading the terms. The correction, the compliance window. The gracious acknowledgement of humanity's relative youth. And then the smile. Shen had initially read it as irrational. A grief for spots misfiring. A cultural display she didn't have the context to interpret. She had the context now. It wasn't irrational. It was recognition. Yara Osei had stood in that room and heard the terms and smiled. Because she recognized the situation. Not just politically, psychologically. Her species had a word for this. For being in a place where the only direction was through. Where the thing you were afraid of losing was already gone. Where the math of survival stopped applying because survival wasn't the variable anymore. Shen wrote her report in 20 minutes. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described what she had found. The second explained why it mattered. The third was a recommendation: immediate de-escalation. Not from weakness, from understanding. The conclave was about to engage a species that did not process pressure the way every other species did. The usual tools, the overwhelming force, the demonstration of cost, the impossible math, were not going to work on a civilization that had already run those numbers on itself and come out the other side, still moving. She filed it with Son Vet's office. The response came back in under an hour. The fleet has already been dispatched. Your findings will be kept on file for post-conflict review. She read it twice. Then she pulled up the recording one more time. Yara Osai, the podium, the smile. She sat with it in the quiet of her office on the conclave's central station, surrounded by files on 21 species that had all, eventually, done the sensible thing. She thought about 63 words. She thought about rockets, 40 years after a wound that should have been the end. She thought about jokes in trenches. She closed the recording. She opened a new file. She started writing a secondary report, a longer one with more data, more context, more evidence, one that couldn't be filed away as a footnote. She would file it in 3 days. By then, the fleet would be 4 days from human space. She filed it anyway. Not because it would change anything. Because the archive should know. Fleet Commander Dara San had done this 17 times. The number mattered to her. Not because she was proud of it, though she was, in the clean and professional way of someone who is good at a difficult job. It mattered because 17 times meant she had the pattern memorized. She knew what a border enforcement deployment looked like at every stage. She knew how the target species responded. She knew the exact shape of the moment when resistance stopped and calculation began, and the other side started counting the cost of continuing. That moment always came. She had been waiting for it for 4 hours now. It had not come. Her fleet had dropped out of FTL at the edge of human-designated space, with the same formation she used for every deployment. Overwhelming in number. Positioned to cut off retreat and communications simultaneously. Every sensor array lit up and feeding data back to her command deck in real time. Efficient. The humans were waiting for them. Not in the panicked way of a species that had spotted the fleet early and scrambled to respond. In the organized way. 80 human warships were positioned in a perimeter that Dara's tactical officer had looked at for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "They knew our approach vector." They guessed, Dara had said. Her tactical officer hadn't argued, but she had the kind of face that argued without words. The engagement started within the hour. Dara's forces were superior in every measurable category. More ships, heavier weapons, better shielding. She knew this. Her officers knew this. The engagement should have followed the familiar shape. Initial skirmish, conclave superiority established, human forces pressured back toward their core systems. Negotiations opened from a position of obvious defeat. The humans didn't fight to win the first skirmish. That was the first thing she noticed. They fought to learn from it. They took hits they could have avoided, positioned ships in places that made no tactical sense on their own, and retreated in patterns that felt wrong in a way she couldn't name for the first 20 minutes. Then she started to see it. They were building a picture. Every move her fleet made, the humans were recording, analyzing, and responding to not just immediately, but 2 moves ahead. They were losing small. They were paying with ships, the way someone pays for information, and the information was her tactics, her formation preferences, her commander's decision patterns under pressure. "They're not fighting the battle in front of them," her tactical officer said. "What battle are they fighting?" Dara asked. No answer, because there wasn't one yet. Hour 6, she deployed her flanking maneuver, the split crescent formation. It was old, older than most of the species in the conclave. She had used it 14 times. It had worked 14 times. It worked because of a fundamental principle of space combat that didn't change regardless of who you were fighting. When a superior force splits and encircles from two angles simultaneously, the surrounded force has three choices, all of them bad. The humans took a fourth option she hadn't listed. They let the crescent close around a dozen of their own ships, sacrificed them, left them inside the encirclement, while the main body of the human fleet rolled perpendicular to the plane of engagement, a direction she hadn't modeled, and hit both arms of her crescent from outside the formation before they could reorient. She lost 9 ships in 6 minutes. Dara-san went very still on the bridge. Around her, her crew kept working. Their hands moved over their stations. Their voices called out readings and coordinates and damage reports. All of it kept happening. The normal machinery of command, and she sat in the center of it and felt something she had not felt in 17 deployments. She felt the shape of the thing change under her. "How did they know the crescent's pivot speed?" she said. Her tactical officer pulled up the data, went through it, looked up. "They baited us into using it twice in the first hour," she said. Smaller scale, seemed like opportunistic positioning. They were timing our reorientation rate. They had baited her into demonstrating a weakness by letting her think she was winning. She pulled up the communication intercepts. Standard procedure: monitor all enemy communications during engagement for morale data and tactical information. Most species went quiet under pressure, or panicked, or started sending desperate messages to their command structures for the signal of a side that was straining. She found a communication between 2 human squadron commanders, sent during the flanking maneuver, while their ships were being encircled, while they were losing people. It was 7 words. Same as the Gallipoli approach. Standard. We've seen it. She read it 3 times. Gallipoli was not a conclave tactical designation. It was a human word. She ran it through the archive. It came back as a reference to a battle fought on their home planet over 1,000 years ago. A battle where a larger force had used encirclement and overwhelming pressure to trap a smaller force on a narrow beachhead. The smaller force had held for 8 months. She sat back. The Conclave had never fought humanity before. No species in the Conclave had. This was first contact with human military capacity, which should have meant everything was new to them, everything a surprise, everything harder to read and respond to. That was always the advantage of a first engagement against a less experienced opponent. The gap between knowing and learning. Except they weren't learning. They were recognizing. They were looking at a fleet formation designed by a civilization they had never encountered, and matching it to something in their own history, and responding with a counter that had been refined across 1,000 years of doing this to themselves. She filed the emergency withdrawal request with Conclave High Command at the end of the 8th hour. She laid out the data plainly: the human adaptation rate, the bait and information gathering, the Gallipoli intercept. She wrote it the way she always wrote reports: factual, sequential, no embellishment. The denial came back in 40 minutes. Continue the engagement. Maintain pressure. Species in early conflict always showed initial adaptability. It would diminish. She read it. She looked out at the battlefield. Another human strike on her right flank. Predicted, partially deflected, but not fully. They were getting faster, not slower. She thought about something Archivist Shen's secondary report had mentioned. She'd read it 2 hours into the deployment, in the brief between engagements. 63 words for surviving. The rockets, 40 years after a wound. They were never slow. They were patient. She turned back to her crew and gave the next set of orders. She would keep fighting. She would keep looking for the moment when calculation kicked in and the humans started counting the cost. She just wasn't sure anymore. That moment was coming. General Amma Voss did her best work at 3 in the morning. Not because she chose to. Because the work didn't stop at 3 in the morning. So neither did she. She sat in the command center of Relay Station Ardent, with the tactical feeds running on 4 screens, and a cup of cold tea she kept forgetting to drink, and made the decisions that needed making. Tonight's decision was this. She could send 6 ships into the Corridor 9 engagement, and hold the line for another 4 days, but those 6 ships would not come back. Or she could pull back from Corridor 9, lose the ground, and save the ships for the strike on the Conclave supply line at the Venn crossing, which would cost them 3 weeks of pressure in that sector, but break the resupply chain for the forward fleet, and ultimately save around 300 people. She did the math. It took her about 4 minutes. She pulled back from Corridor 9. She did not like the decision. She made it anyway. Liking decisions was not the job. The job was knowing which number was bigger and acting on it even when the number you were sacrificing had names attached to it. She had a list of names. She kept it in a physical notebook, handwritten, because she thought it was important that her hand form the letters, not stored in a system somewhere. In her hand, ink on paper. She had been writing in it since the first week of the war. The notebook was getting heavy. She did not think about Kepler's Ridge directly. She was not capable of thinking about it directly and continuing to function was the job. But it was in everything she did, the way a bone heals around a break. You can't see the break anymore, but the shape of the bone has changed. Every calculation she made, every trade she accepted, every name she wrote down, had its shape because of Kepler's Ridge. 47,000 people. She turned back to the screens. 3 months into the war, Sonveth received the first withdrawal notice. It came from the Vethara, one of the smaller conclave species. Their representative had filed it through the formal channels, which was itself a statement. Using the official process meant they were not hiding what they were doing. They were simply no longer providing fleet support to the border engagement. The reason given was resource allocation review. It was a polite way of saying, we watched the engagement data, and we are not doing this. Sonveth read the notice in his office. He read it again. Then he set it down and looked out the viewport at the stars, which were indifferent to everything, as always. In the early stages of a campaign, some member species always got nervous. It was normal. They usually came back in line when the campaign ended quickly, and the benefit of conclave unity was demonstrated. He had always been able to promise that it would end quickly. He was less certain of that now. He read Shen's secondary report, the longer one, for the 3rd time. He had been coming back to it in pieces, not because he agreed with everything in it, because there was a section near the end that he kept returning to about the nature of the conclave's primary tool. The primary tool was cost demonstration. Make resistance too expensive. It worked because most species, when calculating the cost of a war against the conclave, were calculating from the bottom, from a position of wanting to keep what they had. Territory, population, resources. The math always resolved the same way. No matter how proud or stubborn a species was, eventually they looked at what the war was costing them and compared it to what they were trying to protect, and stopped. Shen's report had a single sentence about humanity that he kept reading. A species with nothing left to protect is not fighting to preserve. It is fighting for a different reason entirely, and our cost demonstration model has no framework for that reason. He understood now, handed them a war they could not lose. Not militarily. Militarily, it was still possible for the conclave to win, though less possible than it had been 2 months ago. He meant something else. He had destroyed 47,000 people over a 4 light-minute boundary violation. He had taken something from humanity that could not be given back, and that no peace agreement could erase. And in doing so, he had removed the thing that made cost demonstration work. You could not threaten with loss what a species had already lost. He had made them dangerous in the specific way that only grief made things dangerous. The second withdrawal notice arrived the following week, then a third, 2 days after. 4 conclave species were now quietly absent from the border engagement. Not allied with humanity, just not there. The calculation had shifted, and they had noticed before he had wanted them to notice. He called a council session. 14 senior voices in the main chamber, the same room where Yara Ose had smiled at him. He stood at the center podium, the one usually reserved for the people being addressed, because he thought it was important that he demonstrate he understood the situation had changed. He was not certain they agreed with the gesture, but he made it. He laid out the data without dressing it up. The engagement rates, the human adaptation patterns, the supply line losses after Venn crossing, which had been surgical in a way that suggested very precise intelligence that he did not know how to account for. He laid it out, and then he stopped talking and let them look at it. The chamber was quiet for a long time. The voice from the Lithani, a tall species with 4 arms, who had been in the conclave for 600 years and had seen everything, spoke first. "You are telling us," she said, "that the demonstration failed." "I am telling you," Sonveth said, "that the demonstration was the wrong tool." More silence. "What is the right tool?" He had been thinking about that for 3 weeks. He had an answer, but the answer was not the kind of answer that sounded like strength. It was the kind of answer that a body gives when it has been fighting an infection, and finally accepts that fighting was not the approach. "Negotiation," he said. The word sat in the room. A few of the voices exchanged looks. Not shocked. More like people who had privately arrived at the same conclusion and had been waiting to see who said it first. "A peace envoy," Sonveth said. "Formal terms. Genuine terms. Not the terms I offered Ambassador Ose. Different terms." He did not say what different terms meant. He did not have to. Everyone in the room understood that the conclave was no longer in the position of offering anything. They were in the position of asking. It was a position none of them had been in before. He sent the peace inquiry to humanity's command the following morning. He did not know what to expect. He had studied the smile for 3 months, and he still was not entirely sure what it meant. He understood it better than he had, but understanding something better and understanding it fully were different things. The reply came back in 6 hours. It was not a response. It was a redirect. The message had been forwarded, with a single line of text attached. "This matter has been referred to Ambassador Ose." He sat with that for a while. Then he sent the formal meeting request to Yara Ose herself. She accepted within the hour. No conditions, no list of preliminary demands, no posturing, just yes. He found that more unsettling than a list of demands would have been. The neutral station was called Meridian Point. It existed specifically for conversations like this one. Nobody lived there. A small maintenance crew kept the lights on and the air clean and the conference rooms functional. And then they made themselves scarce when the important people arrived. The architecture was deliberately plain. No high ceilings, no cold light, no design meant to tell anyone where they stood. Just clean walls and a long table, and windows that looked out at a very ordinary stretch of space. Yara Ose arrived first. She sat on the human side of the table and looked out the window, and drank a glass of water and waited. She was wearing the same style of clothes she always wore to these things. Dark, plain, nothing decorative. She had a folder in front of her. She didn't open it. The conclave delegation arrived 14 minutes later. 2 junior voices, 2 advisors, and Sonveth himself. She had expected that. She had been told he requested to attend personally. She understood why, in the same way she understood most things about the conclave by now, not because she found them easy to read, but because she had spent 3 months studying them the way you study something that almost killed you, carefully, without looking away. The delegation settled on their side of the table. There was a moment of adjustment, the small movements of beings who were doing something they hadn't done before and were figuring out the mechanics of it. Then Sonveth looked at her. She looked back. He began with the formal offer. It was, she had to admit, generous. Not what she had expected. The corridor, the original disputed corridor that 3 survey ships had crossed by 4 light minutes, was offered back without conditions. Reparations, calculated by an independent conclave accounting structure, and presented as a formal debt of responsibility. A seat for humanity at the outer ring of conclave governance, which was where new species started before working toward full membership. He laid it out carefully, thoroughly. He was a precise speaker. She had learned that about him. He did not repeat himself. He did not fill space with words that didn't work. She respected that even when she was on the other side of it. When he finished, the room was quiet. She didn't speak yet. She looked at the folder she hadn't opened. She thought about Amavas at 3 in the morning, adding names to a notebook. She thought about Kepler's Ridge, which she always thought about, which she would always think about, but not directly, never directly, because thinking about it directly was not something she could do, and continue to sit in this room and do the job. She said, "It's a good offer." Sonveth waited. 6 months ago, she said, "We would have taken it." He was still. "We would have been grateful," she said. "We would have filed the formal acknowledgement and accepted the governance seat and spent the next 30 years making sure we never drifted 4 light minutes past anything that might look like a boundary. We were good at being small. We had practice." One of his advisors shifted slightly. Sonveth himself didn't move. "I have a counteroffer," she said. "But before I give it to you, I want to answer your question." He looked at her. "I haven't asked a question." "You want to ask one," she said. "You've wanted to ask it for 3 months. You can ask it." A pause. He was not a man who showed uncertainty in obvious ways, but she had learned to read the small version of it in him. The way he went very still when something wasn't matching his models. "The smile," he said, "at the end of the first meeting. I need to understand what it was." She nodded. "You destroyed 47,000 people," she said, "over a boundary that wasn't marked, over a crossing that wasn't hostile. You did it to show us the cost of resistance, so we would calculate it and decide the math didn't work." "Yes," he said, straightforward. She had learned that about him too. He didn't lie about his methods, because in his experience, his methods had always been justifiable by results. "The problem," she said, "is that the math only works if we have something to protect." He was very quiet now. "Every species you've done this to, they were calculating from the bottom. They wanted to keep their territory, their resources, their people alive. You show them what resistance costs, and they weigh it against what they're protecting, and they stop." She paused. "But Kepler's Ridge was already gone. You destroyed it as the opening move. Before anyone calculated anything. Before anyone even had the chance to negotiate." She looked at him. "You took the thing we were afraid of losing. You took it first. And then you invited us to calculate whether resistance was worth it." She let him sit with that. "When I stood in that room and heard your terms, I wasn't angry," she said. "I wasn't in shock. I was," she paused, finding the word, "clear. For the first time in 6 weeks, I was completely clear. You had already done the worst thing. There was nothing left to be afraid of you doing. There was only the question of what we were going to do about what you'd already done." She looked at him. That's what the smile was. It wasn't bravado. It was clarity. The room was silent for a long time. "And the war," he said. His voice was careful. "What were you fighting for, if not survival?" She looked at him steadily. "So it never happens to anyone else," she said. One of the junior voices made a small sound. Sonveth didn't react. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has finally solved a problem that has been sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone for 3 months. And the solution is not what he hoped it would be. "The counteroffer," she said, opening the folder for the first time. "Not the corridor. not a seat at the outer ring. She turned 2 pages toward him. A full seat, full vote, full standing. She let him see the next page. And a rewritten charter, a provision, formally, legally, binding on all member species, that the kind of action taken against Kepler's Ridge can never again be used as a first response. That, before any corrective action against any species, there must be documented negotiation, a minimum cooling period, and a vote. She let him read it. You want to protect the species who come after you, he said. Not a question. That's what we do, she said. That's what we've always done. We just needed someone to be patient enough to wait until we were in a position to do it for someone other than ourselves. Sonveth read the charter pages, then he read them again. His advisors leaned in quietly. There was a murmured exchange she didn't try to hear. He set the pages down. He thought about 43 species. He thought about 43 rooms like the first one, and 43 moments when a civilization looked at the math and folded. He thought about the fact that not one of them had ever asked for this. Not one had ever been in a position to ask for this. He thought about humanity, moving slowly through the stars for 2 centuries. Careful. Deliberate. He had thought it was caution. Shen had known better. Patient. He signed the charter. It took 2 more hours to work through the formal language. The 2 junior voices and the 2 advisors talked through the specifics with Yara's legal team, who had been waiting in the adjacent room. And the details got worked out in the dry, thorough way that legal details always get worked out, with a lot of back and forth over exact wording and not much ceremony. When it was done, Sonveth walked with her to the corridor outside the conference room. He said, I made a mistake. She said, yes. He said, I could not have known the outcome. She looked at him. No, she said, you couldn't. She didn't say it was all right. It wasn't all right. He didn't ask her to say it was. She walked down the corridor toward the docking bay. The lights were ordinary here. The air smelled like recycled oxygen and the faint metallic edge of a working space station. Through a porthole, she could see stars. Ordinary ones, not particularly bright. She stopped at the porthole for a moment. She did not smile. She thought about Kepler's Ridge. She always did. She always would. The notebook where Amma Voss wrote names was getting lighter now. Not lighter because the people came back, because they didn't, but lighter because no new names were being added, and that was the only kind of lighter that was still possible. Yara stood at the porthole for a while. Then she walked on. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The charter would need ratifying by 14 species. She already knew which arguments would work on which voices, because she had spent 3 months learning how the conclave thought, and she intended to use that knowledge for a very long time. 47,000 people. She walked toward the docking bay. The stars were still there when she left. They'd be there when she got back.